Emma had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion on the outskirts of town. The stories of ghosts and strange occurrences had always intrigued her. She decided to explore the mansion with her friends one dark and stormy night. As they approached the mansion, they noticed that the front gate was slightly open. Emma's friends were hesitant, but Emma was determined to explore the mansion. She pushed the gate open and led the way into the overgrown garden. As they made their way to the mansion, the storm grew stronger. Lightning illuminated the sky, revealing the mansion's dilapidated state. The roof had gaping holes, and the windows were shattered. The wind howled through the empty halls, making the hairs on Emma's arms stand on end. As they entered the mansion, they noticed that the air was frigid. The only sound was the creaking of the floorboards under their feet. Emma led the way up a staircase to the second floor. The darkness made it difficult to see, but they eventually found a room with a fireplace. As they huddled around the fire, they heard strange noises coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps and whispers. Emma tried to convince her friends that it was just the wind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. Suddenly, the fireplace went out, plunging the room into darkness. Emma's friends screamed as they heard a sound of something moving closer to them. They tried to escape, but the doors and windows were jammed shut. Emma's heart raced as she felt something cold and clammy touch her shoulder. She turned around to see a ghostly figure standing behind her. It was the ghost of the mansion's former owner, who had been murdered in the very room they were in. The ghostly figure let out a blood-curdling scream, causing Emma and her friends to run for their lives. They eventually managed to escape the mansion, but they were forever haunted by the ghostly encounter. From that day on, Emma never ventured near the haunted mansion again. She learned that some stories are best left untold and some places are best left unexplored. Rachel had always been a successful businesswoman. She had a thriving career, a loving family, and a beautiful home. But one day, her life took a dark turn when she was cursed by a vengeful spirit. It all started with a visit to a remote village during a business trip. Rachel had inadvertently offended a local woman who was rumored to be a witch. The woman had cursed Rachel, warning her that she would never find happiness again. At first, Rachel dismissed the curse as superstition, but soon, she began to notice a string of unfortunate events. Her business deals started falling through, her marriage began to crumble, and her children became distant. Rachel began to feel like she was losing everything she had worked so hard for. As the years passed, Rachel's life continued to spiral out of control. She lost her job, her home, and her family. Everywhere she went, she felt like she was being followed by a dark presence. She couldn't escape the curse that had been placed on her. Desperate for answers, Rachel sought out a shaman who claimed to have the power to break the curse. But the shaman warned her that the curse was too powerful, and that breaking it would come at a great cost. Rachel didn't care. She was willing to do anything to break the curse and regain her life. The shaman performed a ritual that lasted 4 hours, but in the end, he declared that the curse had been broken. Rachel felt a surge of relief as she left the shaman's hut, but her relief was short-lived. As she walked back to her hotel, she felt a strange sensation in her body. Her limbs grew heavy, and her vision blurred. She collapsed on the ground, never to wake up again. The curse had been broken, but at the cost of Rachel's life. Her family mourned her death, and the village where the curse had been placed was forever marked by the tragedy. The moral of the story is that sometimes, the price of breaking a curse is too high to pay, and that some curses are best left alone. Mia had always been a restless sleeper. She often woke up in the middle of the night, feeling like she was being watched. But one night, she woke up to a terrifying sight. As Mia opened her eyes, she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was the shape of a man, but it was completely black and featureless. Mia tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure started to move towards her, its footsteps echoing through the room. Mia tried to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. The figure loomed over her, and she could feel its cold breath on her face. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, leaving Mia alone in the darkness. She tried to convince herself that it was just a nightmare, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The next night, Mia saw the figure again. This time, it was standing outside her window, staring at her with empty eyes. Mia tried to look away, but she couldn't. The figure seemed to be drawing her towards it, with a force that she couldn't resist. Mia's mental health began to deteriorate as the figure continued to haunt her. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, and stopped leaving her house. Her family tried to convince her to seek help, but she refused to leave the room. One night, Mia couldn't take it anymore. She had to confront the figure and find out what it wanted. She got out of bed, opened her window, and stepped out onto the ledge. The figure was waiting for her, and as she approached it, she saw a glint of recognition in its eyes. It was her father, who had died years ago in a car accident. Mia couldn't believe it. Why was her father haunting her? What did he want? The figure spoke to her, in a voice that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It told her that it was here to protect her, to keep her safe from the dangers of the world. Mia felt a wave of relief wash over her. Her father was still with her, even in death. But as she reached out to touch the figure, it disappeared, leaving Mia alone on the ledge. She felt a sudden gust of wind, and before she could react, she lost her balance and fell to her death. Mia's family was devastated by her death. They couldn't understand why she had taken her own life. But Mia knew the truth. The figure that had haunted her was her father's ghost, trying to protect her from the world. But in the end, his protection had led to her demise. The moral of the story is that sometimes, the things we fear the most are the things that we love the most. And that sometimes, even the love of a parent can be suffocating. Marie had always dreamed of becoming an actress. When she landed a lead role in a local theater production, she was over the moon with excitement. But little did she know that the theater was haunted by a phantom that was determined to stop the show. As rehearsals began, strange things started happening. Props would move on their own, and lights would flicker on and off. The cast and crew brushed it off as harmless pranks, but Marie couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at work. One night, as Marie was rehearsing her lines on stage, she saw a figure lurking in the shadows. She called out, but there was no response. When she went to investigate, she found that the figure had disappeared. As the opening night drew near, the strange occurrences became more frequent. The cast and crew were on edge, but they were determined to put on a good show. But on the night of the performance, things took a terrifying turn. As Marie was performing her big solo, she saw the phantom appear on stage. It was a ghastly figure, dressed in a tattered cloak and mask. Marie tried to continue with her performance, but the phantom began to taunt her, causing her to freeze on stage. The audience was stunned as they watched the drama unfold. But what they didn't know was that the phantom was not a prankster or a ghost, but a disgruntled former actor who had been fired from the theater years ago. He had been lurking in the shadows, determined to stop the show and get his revenge. In the chaos that ensued, Marie and the rest of the cast managed to escape the theater unscathed. But the phantom was never caught. From that day on, the theater was known as a haunted place, and nobody wanted to perform there again. Marie eventually gave up her dream of becoming an actress, unable to shake the trauma of that night. And the phantom continued to haunt the theater, forever seeking his revenge. John was a respected member of his small town. He was known for his kindness, his honesty, and his willingness to help others. But one day, John's life took a dark turn when he became the victim of a demonic possession. It all started with a strange dream. John dreamed that he was being visited by a dark entity that promised him power and control. When he woke up, he felt a strange energy coursing through his body, and he knew that something was wrong. At first, John tried to ignore the strange sensations, but as time went on, he began to experience violent mood swings and erratic behavior. He would scream and curse at his family, and he would lash out at his neighbors for no reason. The townspeople were shocked by John's sudden change in behavior. They didn't know what to make of the once honorable man who had become a monster. Some whispered that he was possessed by a demon, but most dismissed it as superstition. But as the days passed, John's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He would talk to himself in strange tongues, and he would perform bizarre rituals in his backyard. The townspeople grew more and more afraid of him, and they started to avoid him at all costs. One night, as John was performing one of his rituals, he summoned a demon that possessed him completely. The demon used John's body to wreak havoc on the town. He destroyed homes, attacked people, and caused chaos wherever he went. The townspeople were terrified, and they realized too late that John's possession was real. They tried to exorcise the demon from John's body, but it was too strong. In the end, they were forced to kill John to stop the demon's rampage. The town was forever changed by the events that transpired. They mourned the loss of John, the once honorable man who had become a victim of a demonic possession. And they realized that sometimes, evil can come from the most unexpected places. The moral of the story is that sometimes, even the most honorable people can fall victim to the forces of darkness, and that it's important to be vigilant against evil, even in our own communities. Leela was driving home from a friend's house late at night. She had been on the road for hours, and she was running low on gas. She saw an empty gas station up ahead and decided to stop and fill up. As she pulled into the gas station, she noticed that there were no other cars around. The place was deserted, and it gave her an eerie feeling. She tried to shake it off and focused on filling up her tank. But as she was pumping gas, she heard strange noises coming from the gas station building. She thought she heard footsteps and whispers, but when she looked around, there was nobody there. Leela was starting to feel nervous, but she told herself that she was being paranoid. She finished filling up her tank and got back into her car. But as she was about to pull away, she saw a figure in her rearview mirror. It was a man, dressed in all black, with a hood over his head. He was standing by the gas station building, watching her. Leela was terrified, but she tried to remain calm. She drove away as quickly as she could, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was following her. As she drove down the dark, deserted road, she saw the man's figure in her rearview mirror again. He was following her, and she could see the glint of a knife in his hand. Leela sped up, trying to outrun the man, but he kept getting closer. She was about to give up hope when she saw a police car up ahead. She honked her horn and pulled over, and the man disappeared into the darkness. The police officer approached her car and asked her what was wrong. Leela told him everything that had happened, and the officer told her that she was lucky to be alive. He explained that the gas station was known for being a hut for criminals and that she should never have stopped there at midnight. From that day on, Leela never forgot the terrifying experience she had at the gas station, and she made sure to always fill up her gas tank before it got too low, so she would never have to stop at a deserted gas station again. The moral of the story is that sometimes, it's best to trust your instincts and avoid dangerous situations, even if it means taking a detour or going out of your way. Avery had just moved into her new apartment, and she was excited to start this new chapter of her life. But when she met her male roommate, Jake, she got an uneasy feeling. Jake was tall and thin, with deep-set eyes and a strange way of speaking. Avery tried to brush off her unease and settled into her new room, hoping that things would get better. But things didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. Jake would always come into her room without knocking, and he would make inappropriate comments about her appearance. Avery felt uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to confront him. One night, Avery woke up to a strange sound. She heard someone moving around in her room. She sat up, but the room was dark, and she couldn't see anything. She heard a strange breathing sound, and she realized that someone was standing right next to her bed. Avery was too terrified to move. She didn't know what to do. But then, she heard Jake's voice. "Hey, Avery," he said. "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd come in here and talk to you." Avery was angry and scared at the same time. She told Jake to leave, but he just laughed and said that he wasn't going anywhere. That was the final straw for Avery. She knew she had to get out of there. She packed her bags and left the apartment the next day, never looking back. Years later, Avery heard that Jake had been arrested for a series of brutal murders. She shuddered, thinking about what might have happened to her if she had stayed in that apartment with him. The moral of the story is that it's important to trust your instincts and take action when you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Don't stay in a situation that doesn't feel right, even if it means leaving behind something that you had been looking forward to. David had been an Uber driver for a few months now. He enjoyed the job, and the extra cash was always helpful. But one night, he picked up a passenger that would change his life forever. It was a late-night ride, and David was feeling a bit tired. He picked up the passenger, a woman who appeared to be in her late 20s, and started driving towards her destination. The woman was quiet, and David didn't think much of it. But then, they turned onto a dark and deserted road. The streetlights were dim, and the trees seemed to loom ominously over the road. David began to feel uneasy. As they continued down the road, the woman suddenly spoke up. "Can you stop the car, please?" she asked. David pulled over, and the woman got out of the car. She walked to the trunk and opened it up. David was confused. He didn't know what she was doing. Then, he saw the body in the trunk. David was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move or speak. The woman turned around and looked at him with a sinister smile. "I'm sorry, David," she said. "You've been a great driver, but I can't have any witnesses." David tried to run, but the woman was too fast. She caught up to him and plunged a knife into his stomach. David fell to the ground, bleeding and gasping for air. The woman got back into the car and drove away, leaving David to die on the side of the road. The moral of the story is to always be cautious when driving for ride-sharing services, and to trust your instincts if a situation feels unsafe or uncomfortable. You never know who your passengers might really be, and it's important to stay alert and aware at all times. John woke up to find himself lying on the ground in the middle of a dense forest. He had no idea how he ended up there or why he was there. John tried to remember what had happened, but his memory was blank. He didn't even know his name or where he was from. He looked around, but the forest seemed endless. He didn't recognize anything. John tried to stand up, but he was too weak. He had no food or water and was completely disoriented. Panic set in as he realized he was lost and alone. As night began to fall, John stumbled upon a small clearing in the forest. There was a small fire burning in the middle of the clearing, and a figure sitting beside it. "Who are you?" John asked, but the figure didn't respond. John walked closer, and as he got closer, he saw that the figure was a skeleton. He tried to run away, but the skeleton started to move. It stood up and started to chase him. John ran as fast as he could, but the skeleton was relentless. It chased him through the forest, always just out of sight but never far behind. John could feel its bony fingers reaching out to grab him. As the night wore on, John grew more and more tired. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. Finally, he collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The skeleton loomed over him, its bony hand reaching out to grab him. John closed his eyes and waited for the end. But when he opened his eyes again, he was back in his own bed. It had all been a nightmare. The moral of the story is that sometimes our fears and anxieties can manifest themselves in our dreams, and it's important to confront and overcome them. It's also important to always be aware of our surroundings and to never let our guard down, even in our own dreams. Emily had always been plagued by nightmares, but one in particular stuck with her. In the dream, she was trapped in a dark and twisted forest, with no way out. As she wandered through the forest, she came across a strange figure. It was a man, but his face was twisted and deformed, and his eyes glowed red in the darkness. The man started to chase her, his twisted limbs moving in unnatural ways. Emily tried to run, but she felt like she was moving through molasses. She was trapped, with no way out. Just as the man was about to grab her, Emily woke up, drenched in sweat. She was relieved to find that it was just a nightmare, but something about the dream stayed with her. Over the next few days, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she turned around, she felt like the strange man from her dream was there, lurking in the shadows. One night, Emily woke up to find the man from her nightmare standing at the foot of her bed. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man reached out and touched her forehead, and suddenly everything went black. When Emily woke up again, she was back in a dark forest from her dream. But this time, it was different. The trees were twisted and blackened, and the air was thick with a putrid smell. The man was there again, but this time he was different too. His twisted features were even more pronounced, and his eyes glowed brighter than ever before. He started to chase Emily again, his limbs moving in unnatural ways. But this time, she was able to run faster than before. She could feel the man's hot breath on her neck, but she didn't look back. She just ran. Finally, Emily burst through the trees and into a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small cottage. Emily ran to the cottage and banged on the door, screaming for help. The door opened, and an old woman appeared. "What are you doing here?" the woman asked. Emily tried to explain, but the words caught in her throat. Finally, she just said, "I don't know. I don't know how I got here." The old woman nodded. "You're in the spirit world now," she said. "You're lucky to have made it this far." Emily didn't understand what the old woman meant, but she was grateful for her help. The old woman gave Emily some food and water, and showed her a place to rest. When Emily woke up again, she was back in her own bed. She never had a nightmare again, but she always wondered what had happened to her in the spirit world. On a dark and stormy night, a group of friends decided to go on a hike in the woods. They had always enjoyed the thrill of exploring new places, and the eerie atmosphere of the forest only added to their excitement. As they walked deeper into the woods, they started to notice strange things. The trees seemed to be closing in on them, and they heard whispers on the wind that they couldn't quite make out. Their nerves were on edge, but they continued on. After a while, they came across an old abandoned cabin. It looked as if it hadn't been used in years, with the windows boarded up and the door hanging off its hinges. Despite their unease, they decided to investigate. As they entered the cabin, they were met with a sense of foreboding. The air was thick with dust and the floorboards creaked underfoot. Suddenly, they heard a noise coming from the basement. Curiosity got the better of them, and they descended the creaky stairs into the dark, musty cellar. As they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small room, filled with strange and ominous symbols on the walls. The room was cold, and they could hear a faint humming sound. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them, and they turned to see a hooded figure standing in the doorway. They froze, unsure of what to do. The figure slowly approached them, and they could see the glint of a knife in its hand. Just as they thought they were done for, the figure pulled off its hood to reveal that it was their friend, playing a prank on them. They all breathed a sigh of relief, laughing at how scared they had been. But as they turned to leave, they realized that the door to the cellar was now locked, trapping them inside. The room grew colder and darker, and the humming sound grew louder. They realized that their friend was not the one behind this, and that they were truly trapped. As they huddled together, they heard the faint sound of chanting coming from outside the door. They knew then that they were not alone, and that whatever was out there, it was not human. The unexpected twist was that the friends thought they had been pranked, but it turned out that they were actually trapped with something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. It was a warm summer evening, and Lily was walking home from her night shift at the local diner. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She looked around, but there was no one in sight. As she neared her apartment building, she heard a rustling noise behind her. She turned, but once again, there was no one there. Her heart racing, she quickened her pace and made it to her building. As she entered her apartment, she breathed a sigh of relief. She locked the door behind her and settled down on her couch to watch some TV. But as she sat there, she started to feel uneasy again. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Suddenly, she heard a scratching noise coming from the front door. She tried to ignore it, but it grew louder and more insistent. She got up to investigate, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached the door, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her through the peephole. She screamed and stumbled backwards, falling onto the couch. The scratching continued, and the eyes grew closer. She realized then that whatever was on the other side of the door was not human. It was something dark and malevolent, something that wanted to do her harm. Just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the scratching stopped. She cautiously got up and peered through the peephole, but there was nothing there. She breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it had all been a hallucination. But as she turned around, she saw a shadowy figure looming over her. It had been inside the apartment all along, hiding in the shadows. She tried to scream, but it was too late. The figure lunged at her, and she knew that she was doomed. It was late at night, and Tom was closing up his vape shop for the evening. He was tired after a long day at work, but he was looking forward to going home and getting some rest. As he finished locking up the shop, he heard a noise coming from the alleyway behind the building. He turned to investigate, but before he could react, he was jumped by a group of masked men. The men were armed, and they demanded that Tom hand over all of the cash and valuables in the store. Tom tried to reason with them, but they were insistent. They had come to rob the store, and they weren't leaving without what they came for. As Tom handed over the cash register, he tried to think of a way out of the situation. But the men were too quick, and they had him cornered. He knew that he was in grave danger. Just as he thought he was done for, he saw a glimmer of hope. One of the men had dropped a flashlight, and it had rolled across the floor. In a desperate move, Tom lunged for the flashlight, grabbing it before the robbers could react. He swung the flashlight with all his might, hitting one of the robbers in the head. The man fell to the ground, unconscious. The others were momentarily stunned, and Tom took advantage of the opportunity to escape. He ran out of the store, sprinting down the street as fast as he could. He could hear the robbers chasing him, but he didn't look back. He knew that if he stopped, they would catch him. As he rounded the corner, he saw a police car parked on the street. He ran up to the officers, gasping for breath, and explained what had happened. The officers quickly apprehended the robbers, and Tom was relieved to be safe. But as he looked back at his store, he realized that it would never be the same. The fear and trauma of that night would stay with him forever. John had always been fascinated by the occult, and he spent many hours exploring old cemeteries and abandoned buildings in search of supernatural phenomena. One day, he stumbled upon a decrepit old tombstone that seemed to be emitting an eerie glow. Intrigued, he approached the tombstone to investigate. As he drew closer, he realized that the glow was coming from inside the tombstone. Without thinking, he reached out to touch it. But as soon as his fingers brushed the surface, he was engulfed in a blinding light. When he opened his eyes, he found himself trapped inside a tombstone. He could see the outside world, but he couldn't escape. He pounded on the walls, but they were solid and unyielding. As he sat there, trapped and alone, he realized that he wasn't alone after all. He could hear strange whispers and creaking noises coming from all around him. The tombstone was haunted, and he was trapped with the spirits of the dead. For days he sat there, desperate for help and a way to be freed. He screamed for help, but no one could hear him. He tried to pry the walls open with his bare hands, but it was no use. One night, as he sat there in the darkness, he heard a voice calling out to him. It was a woman's voice, soft and soothing. She promised to help him escape the tombstone, but only if he promised to serve her. Desperate for a way out, John agreed. The woman's voice grew louder, and suddenly, he felt a surge of power flowing through him. The walls of the tombstone crumbled, and he was free. But as he stepped out into the night, he realized that he had made a terrible mistake. The woman's voice was not benevolent, but malevolent. She had used him as a vessel, and now he was possessed by a dark force. After John realized that he was possessed by an evil spirit, he tried to fight it off, but the spirit was too strong, and it took control of his body and mind. He began to act strangely, talking to himself and having terrifying nightmares. He started to avoid people and stopped going to work. His friends and family noticed that something was wrong, but they didn't know what to do. As time went on, John's behavior grew more and more erratic. He would lash out at those around him, and his eyes had a dark, sinister look. It was as if he was no longer himself, but a vessel for the evil spirit that had possessed him. One night, John disappeared. His family and friends searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Weeks went by, and there was no sign of John. His loved ones feared the worst, and they mourned his loss. But then, one day, they received a message from John himself. The message was written in a strange, unknown language. But when it was translated, it revealed a chilling truth. John was no longer alive, at least not in the way they had known him. His body had been taken over by the evil spirit, and now he was trapped in the realm of the dead. The message warned that the spirit was still out there, seeking new vessels to possess. It was a chilling reminder that the world was full of dark forces, and that even those who sought to explore the supernatural could fall victim to their power. The fate of John serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder that there are things beyond our understanding that we should approach with caution and respect. Emma had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would sleep with the lights on and would never venture out at night. But as she grew older, she tried to overcome her fear. She would take walks at night, hoping to desensitize herself to the darkness. One night, as she was walking through a deserted park, she heard a strange sound. It was a rustling in the bushes, like something was moving around. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes and looking disheveled. Emma tried to back away, but the man blocked her path. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse and trembling. "You have to help me. I'm lost, and I don't know where I am." Emma was scared, but she also felt a sense of compassion. She decided to help the man, and together, they started walking through the park. As they walked, Emma realized that the man was not leading her to safety, but deeper into the darkness. As they walked, Emma's fear grew stronger. She was certain that the man was going to harm her, but she couldn't escape. She tried to reason with him, to plead with him to let her go, but it was no use. Finally, they reached a clearing in the park. The man turned to Emma, his eyes glowing in the darkness. "You've been so kind," he said. "I'll make your death quick." Emma realized too late that the man was not lost, but a dangerous predator who had been waiting for a victim to prey upon. She screamed, but it was too late. The man attacked her, and Emma knew that she was going to die. But then, something unexpected happened. The man suddenly fell to the ground, convulsing in pain. Emma looked around and saw a figure standing in the shadows, holding a strange object. It was a hunter, who had been tracking the man for weeks. He had finally caught up with him and had saved Emma's life. Emma was shaken but grateful. She had survived an encounter with a dangerous predator, thanks to the intervention of a stranger in the night. She knew that she would never be able to fully overcome her fear of the dark, but she also knew that there were good people out there who were willing to protect the vulnerable. Emily had always been curious about the abandoned house at the end of her street. The house had been empty for as long as she could remember, and there were all sorts of rumors about why it had been abandoned. One night, Emily decided to investigate. She snuck out of her house and made her way to the abandoned house. As she walked through the overgrown garden, she felt a sense of unease. The front door was unlocked, and Emily pushed it open. The house was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. Emily's heart was pounding as she made her way through the house, searching for clues about why it had been abandoned. As she walked through one of the rooms, she heard a strange noise. It was a low, rumbling sound, like something was moving in the walls. Emily froze, her heart racing in her chest. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes and looking pale and ghostly. Emily screamed, but the woman did not seem to hear her. The woman walked towards Emily, her eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room. Emily looked in the direction of the woman's gaze, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. It was a portrait of the woman, hanging on the wall. But it was not just any portrait, it was a portrait of Emily herself. Emily realized too late that she had stumbled into a haunted house, and that the ghostly woman was trying to warn her about something. But it was too late. The ghostly woman had disappeared, and Emily was trapped in the house. As she searched for a way out, Emily realized that the house was not just haunted by the ghost of the woman. It was also haunted by the spirits of all the people who had died there, victims of a terrible tragedy that had taken place years ago. Emily knew that she had to find a way out of the house, but the spirits were closing in on her. She could hear their voices, whispering in the darkness. Finally, Emily stumbled upon a hidden door, and she pushed it open. She saw a glimmer of light, and she realized that it was her way out. She ran through the door and into the night, her heart racing in her chest. As she looked back at the abandoned house, she saw the ghostly figures peering out at her from the windows. Emily knew that she had narrowly escaped with her life, and that she would never forget the terror of the haunted house at the end of her street. It was a dark and stormy night, and the only sound in the house was the ticking of the clock. Jenny had always been afraid of storms, and tonight was no exception. She huddled under her blankets, trying to block out the thunder and lightning. As she tried to fall asleep, she heard a strange sound coming from outside her window. It was a scratching sound, like something was trying to claw its way into her room. Jenny's heart was pounding in her chest as she slowly pulled back the covers and made her way towards the window. As she got closer, the scratching sound grew louder and more insistent. Finally, she reached the window and looked outside. What she saw made her scream. There, clinging to the side of the house, was a grotesque creature with twisted, gnarled limbs and glowing red eyes. It was trying to force its way into the house, using its sharp claws to scratch at the walls. Jenny knew that she had to do something. She stumbled backwards, trying to find something to defend herself with. As she rummaged through her room, the creature's scratching grew louder and more frantic. Finally, Jenny found what she was looking for, a large flashlight. She held it tightly in her hand as she made her way back to the window. As she shone the light outside, she saw that the creature was still there, its red eyes fixed on her. Jenny took a deep breath and aimed the flashlight directly at the creature's face. To her surprise, the creature let out a howl of pain and recoiled, falling from the side of the house and landing with a sickening thud on the ground below. Jenny breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto her bed. As she closed her eyes, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. "Thank you, Jenny," the voice said. "You have saved us all." Jenny's eyes flew open, and she realized that the creature outside her window was not a monster at all. It was a guardian spirit, protecting her from an even greater evil that lurked outside. As the storm raged on outside, Jenny felt a sense of gratitude for the strange and mysterious forces that had saved her life. She knew that she would never forget the terrifying night when she faced her fears and emerged victorious. Mark had always been an adventurer at heart, and there was no challenge he enjoyed more than climbing mountains. He had conquered some of the tallest peaks in the world, and he was always on the lookout for his next great adventure. One summer, Mark decided to take on the challenge of Mount Everest. It was the tallest peak in the world, and he knew that it would be a grueling climb, but he was confident in his abilities. As he began his ascent, Mark felt a sense of exhilaration that he had never experienced before. The climb was difficult, but he was making good progress. However, as he approached the summit, something strange began to happen. The air grew colder and the wind picked up, making it difficult to see. Mark felt a sense of unease creeping over him, and he began to wonder if he had made a mistake by attempting the climb. As he reached the summit, Mark was hit by a sudden gust of wind that nearly knocked him off his feet. He tried to steady himself, but he found that he couldn't move. It was as if something was holding him in place, keeping him from moving forward. Mark looked around, trying to see what was happening. That's when he saw it. A dark, shadowy figure was looming over him, blocking his path. Mark tried to run, but the figure seemed to follow him, always staying just out of reach. He was trapped on the summit, unable to move or escape. As the hours passed, Mark began to feel a sense of despair. He knew that he was trapped on the mountain, with no way to call for help or escape. The figure continued to haunt him, and he felt as though he was being consumed by its dark energy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was a rescue helicopter, sent to save him from his desperate situation. As he was airlifted to safety, Mark looked back at the mountain and saw the shadowy figure disappear into the mist. He knew that he had narrowly escaped with his life, and he would never forget the terrifying experience that he had endured. From that day on, Mark decided that he would stick to climbing smaller, less treacherous mountains. He knew that he had been lucky to survive, and he didn't want to push his luck any further. Alice had always been an adventurous person, but when she woke up in an underground labyrinth, She knew that she had gotten herself into something much more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. As she looked around, Alice realized that she was deep underground, surrounded by nothing but cold, damp walls. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. Alice tried to find her way out, but every path she took seemed to lead her deeper into the labyrinth. She tried to retrace her steps, but the walls all looked the same, and she quickly became disoriented. As she continued to wander through the labyrinth, Alice began to hear strange noises in the distance. She could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls, and the faint whispers of something sinister. She tried to ignore the sounds and press on, but the deeper she went, the more she felt like she was being watched. Alice knew that she needed to find a way out, but every path seemed to lead to a dead end. After what felt like hours, Alice stumbled upon a strange room, lit by torches that flickered ominously. In the center of the room stood a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols and markings. Alice tried to back away, but she found that she was unable to move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped by some unknown force. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a tall, dark figure that seemed to be made of pure darkness. Alice tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure approached her, its eyes glowing red in the dim light of the torches. Alice knew that she was trapped, with no hope of escape. Just when she thought all was lost, the figure suddenly vanished, and Alice found herself back in her own bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, gasping for breath, and realized that it had all been a dream. But as she looked around her room, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small, black stone, covered in the same strange symbols that she had seen in the labyrinth. Alice knew that she had never seen the stone before, but she also knew that it was somehow connected to the dream that she had just had. She tried to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her, but she knew that she would never forget the terrifying experience that she had just endured. Jenna had been working at a fast food restaurant for months, but she never thought that her job would turn into a nightmare. It was late at night, and the restaurant was nearly empty. Jenna was busy cleaning up, when she heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. At first, she thought that it was just the fryer making noise, but then she heard it again, a strange scratching sound. Jenna cautiously made her way into the kitchen, but everything looked normal. The fryer was still, the grill was off, and there was no one else in the restaurant. She tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over her, but she couldn't ignore the strange scratching sound that she had heard. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of something out of the corner of her eye. It was a figure, lurking in the shadows, watching her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped out of the shadows, revealing a grotesque face that was twisted into a malicious grin. Jenna tried to run, but she found that she was rooted to the spot. The figure approached her, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Jenna knew that she was in grave danger, but she couldn't move, trapped by some unknown force. Just when she thought that all was lost, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving Jenna alone in the kitchen. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her, but she knew that she would never forget the terrifying experience that she had just endured. From that day on, Jenna was never quite the same. She always felt like something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Whenever she walked into the restaurant, she could feel the presence of the figure, lurking in the shadows. Jenna knew that she could never forget the terror that she had felt that night, and she knew that she would never be the same again. It was a stormy night in the small town of Millfield. John, a local resident, was driving home from work when he saw a woman standing at the side of the road, drenched from the rain. Feeling sorry for her, John pulled over and offered her a ride. The woman climbed into the back seat of his car, and John asked her where she needed to go. She gave him an address, and John started to drive. As they made their way down the deserted roads, John noticed that the woman was eerily quiet. He tried to make conversation, but she only gave short, one-word answers. When they finally arrived at the address she had given him, John turned to the back seat to tell the woman they had arrived, but she was nowhere to be found. He searched the car, but there was no sign of her. Shaken, John drove home, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. But as he climbed into bed, he heard a soft whisper in his ear, "Thank you for the ride." John sat bolt upright, but there was no one there. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Over the next few nights, John was plagued by strange occurrences. Objects would move on their own, and he would hear whispers in the darkness. He tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. One night, John woke up to find the woman from the side of the road standing at the foot of his bed. She was pale and ghostly, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. John tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The woman floated closer, until she was inches from his face. And then, in a flash of blinding light, she disappeared. From that night on, John refused to drive alone at night. He always felt like he was being watched, and he never forgot the terror of that stormy night in Millfield. Katie had always been fascinated by the old abandoned mansion at the edge of town. It was said to be haunted by the ghosts of the family who had once lived there, and Katie couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. One night, she convinced her friends to join her on a dare to explore the mansion. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they snuck onto the property and made their way inside. The mansion was dark and musty, with cobwebs covering the furniture and debris scattered across the floor. As they made their way through the empty rooms, they began to hear strange noises, whispers and footsteps coming from the shadows. But Katie wasn't scared. She was thrilled by the idea of encountering a ghost. So when they came across a locked door in the basement, she was the first to suggest they try to find a way in. With a bit of effort, they managed to break open the door. But what they found inside wasn't what they expected. Instead of ghosts, they found a secret laboratories filled with strange equipment and glowing vials. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching. Fearing they had been caught, they hid behind a nearby shelf. But it wasn't the ghost of the mansion's former occupants who had found them. It was a group of scientists. The mansion wasn't abandoned after all. It was a research facility, where they were conducting illegal experiments on human subjects. As the scientists advanced on them, Katie and her friends realized they had stumbled onto something far more terrifying than ghosts. They ran for their lives, desperate to escape the mansion and the horrors within. From that night on, Katie never sought out the unknown again. She learned the hard way that sometimes, the real monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight. Emily had always been fascinated by the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. It had been closed for years, and she had heard rumors of strange happenings within its decaying walls. One day, Emily decided to explore the park on her own. She snuck past the chained gates and wandered through the empty pathways, marveling at the rusted rides and faded signs. But as she made her way deeper into the park, she began to feel like she was being watched. Every time she turned around, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. But when she looked directly at it, there was nothing there. As the sun began to set, Emily decided to leave. But when she turned around, she saw a figure standing in front of her, a clown, with a wide, toothy grin and an ominous presence. The clown began to chase her, his laughter echoing through the empty park. Emily ran as fast as she could, but he seemed to be getting closer and closer. Just when she thought all was lost, she saw a group of teenagers approaching. They chased the clown away, and Emily was able to escape unharmed. But as she walked away from the park, she realized something strange. The teenagers who had saved her were dressed in clothing from the 1950s. It was as if they had stepped out of another era. Emily never returned to the abandoned amusement park again. She knew that something otherworldly was lurking within its walls, and she didn't want to risk encountering it again. It was a dark and stormy night when Sarah's car broke down on the side of the road. She was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no other cars in sight. Desperate for help, she spotted a nearby house and decided to approach it. But as she walked up the driveway, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped inside. The house was dark and musty, with cobwebs in the corners and an eerie silence filling the air. Suddenly, she heard footsteps coming from upstairs. She froze, listening as they grew louder and closer. Just as she was about to turn and run, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a man, with a twisted smile and a glint in his eye. He started to chase her, and Sarah ran through the house, searching for a way out. But every door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut. She was trapped. As the man closed in on her, Sarah suddenly woke up in her own bed, drenched in sweat. It had all been a nightmare. But when she went to turn on the light, she realized that the man from her dream was standing in the corner of the room, watching her with a cold, menacing stare. Sarah screamed, but it was too late. She was trapped once again, and there was no escape. As Sarah screamed in terror, the man slowly stepped towards her. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground. The man reached out and touched her face, and she could feel his cold fingers against her skin. He leaned in and whispered in her ear, "You can't escape me. I'll always be with you." With a final, bone-chilling laugh, the man disappeared into thin air. Sarah was left alone in a dark and empty room, her heart racing and her mind consumed by fear. For weeks, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching her, lurking in the shadows and waiting for his chance to strike again. She stopped sleeping, stopped going out at night, stopped living her life altogether. Eventually, she sought the help of a therapist, who diagnosed her with severe anxiety and PTSD. With time and treatment, Sarah learned to cope with her fears, and eventually, she was able to move on with her life. But every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye, or hear a faint, chilling laugh in the silence of the night. And she would be reminded of the man who had haunted her dreams, and who had left a permanent mark on her soul. Jenna was always fascinated by abandoned buildings. So when she heard about the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist the urge to explore it. She packed a flashlight, some water, and a camera, and set out on her adventure. The building was overgrown with vines and the windows were boarded up, but she managed to find a way in through a broken door. As she made her way through the dark, empty hallways, Jenna felt a growing sense of unease. The air was thick with a musty smell, and every creak and groan of the old building seemed to echo through the halls. Suddenly, Jenna heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint, ghostly whisper that seemed to be coming from all around her. She tried to run, but she found herself trapped in a maze of dark corridors that seemed to shift and change around her. And then she saw them, the ghostly figures of patients, wandering aimlessly through the halls, their eyes glazed over with madness. Jenna screamed and ran, but the patients seemed to be closing in on her from all sides. Just when she thought all hope was lost, she stumbled upon a room with an old typewriter in it. Desperate for an escape, she began to type out a message, begging for help. To her surprise, the typewriter began to type on its own, forming a response to her message. The response was short and cryptic: "You are not alone. I'm with you." And then, suddenly, Jenna found herself outside the building, the sun shining down on her face. She turned around to look at the old asylum, but it was gone, vanished without a trace. Years later, Jenna still can't explain what happened that day. But she knows one thing for sure: she'll never forget the feeling of being trapped in that haunted building, with no escape in sight. Sam had always been afraid of the dark, ever since he was a child. But as he grew older, he tried to push those fears aside and be brave. One night, Sam found himself driving down a long, deserted road in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and he was exhausted from a long day of work. As he drove, he noticed that his headlights seemed to be getting dimmer and dimmer. Before he knew it, his headlights went out completely, leaving him stranded in the dark. Sam's heart raced as he tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. He got out of the car and began to walk, hoping to find some help. But as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Suddenly, he heard a low growl. He turned around to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him. As the creature lunged, Sam realized too late that he was face to face with a werewolf. He tried to run, but the werewolf was too fast. It knocked him to the ground and pinned him down, ready to attack. As the creature opened its jaws to bite down, Sam closed his eyes and braced for the worst. But when he opened them again, he saw something that he never would have believed possible. The werewolf had transformed into a human, and was now lying unconscious on top of him. Sam quickly got to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. Years later, Sam still can't explain what happened that night. But one thing he knows for sure: he'll never forget the terror of being face to face with a werewolf in the middle of the night. Emily always felt a little uneasy when she was alone in her apartment, but she had gotten used to it. That is, until strange things started happening. At first, it was just small things like a chair being moved or a door closing by itself. Emily tried to brush it off as her imagination, but then it started to escalate. One night, Emily was in bed when she heard footsteps in her hallway. She sat up, listening intently, but they stopped as suddenly as they started. The next night, she woke up to find her bedroom door slowly opening. She sat up in bed, frozen with fear as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman with long, dark hair and sunken eyes. She moved toward Emily with a slow, deliberate gait, and Emily could feel her breath on her face. Suddenly, the woman's face twisted into a sinister grin. "I've been waiting for you," she whispered. Emily tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The woman reached out and touched her forehead, and everything went black. When Emily woke up, she was lying in a hospital bed with a nurse standing over her. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. The nurse explained that she had been found unconscious in her apartment and brought to the hospital. But when Emily told her about the woman, the nurse looked confused. "There was no woman in your apartment," she said. "Just you." Emily never went back to her apartment after that. To this day, she still has no idea what happened to her, or who the woman with the sunken eyes really was. Riley and her friends had always been interested in exploring abandoned buildings, so when they heard about an old, derelict mansion on the outskirts of town, they jumped at the chance to explore it. As they approached the mansion, they could feel a sense of unease creeping over them. The windows were boarded up and the doors were rusted shut, but they eventually found a way in through a broken window. As they explored the mansion, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every creaking floorboard and rustling of the wind seemed to be amplified, making them more and more anxious. Suddenly, Riley's friend Jenna let out a blood-curdling scream. The others rushed to her side to find her staring in horror at a strange figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a twisted grin. He moved towards them slowly, his limbs jerking and twitching in a way that made them feel sick to their stomachs. Riley and her friends ran, but they soon realized that they were trapped. The mansion seemed to shift and twist around them, trapping them in a maze of hallways and rooms. As they frantically searched for a way out, they could hear the figure getting closer and closer. His laughter echoed through the halls, and they could feel his breath on their necks. Just when they thought they were trapped forever, they burst through a door and found themselves outside. They ran for what seemed like hours, not daring to look back. When they finally stopped, panting and sweating, they realized that they had no idea where they were. The landscape was twisted and distorted, like something out of a nightmare. And that's when they heard her laughter once again, echoing through the trees. They knew that they had to keep running, or else they would be trapped forever in the nightmare world of the derelict mansion. As the group huddled together in fear, they heard a sound of something moving around outside a cabin. The footsteps were heavy and deliberate, and seemed to circle the cabin before coming to a stop in front of the door. Suddenly, the door burst open and the creature revealed itself. It was a massive humanoid figure, standing at least 8 feet tall. Its skin was a sickly green color, and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The creature reached out with its massive hand and grabbed one of the group members, lifting them up off the ground effortlessly. The others tried to fight back, but their efforts were futile against the creature's immense strength. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, one of the group members remembered the old legend about the creature. According to the legend, the creature was vulnerable to fire. With nothing else to lose, the group quickly grabbed anything they could find that would burn and set the cabin ablaze. The creature shrieked in pain as it caught fire, and eventually collapsed to the ground, motionless. The group managed to escape the burning cabin and make their way back to civilization, but they would never forget the terror they experienced that night. There was a man named Jack who was an amateur astronomer. He loved nothing more than spending his nights gazing up at the stars with his trusty telescope. One night, as he was scanning the sky, he spotted something he had never seen before. It was a dark object, moving quickly through the night sky. At first, he thought it might be a satellite, but as he continued to watch, he realized that it was too big and too irregular in shape to be man-made. As he watched in awe, the object suddenly stopped in midair and began to hover directly over Jack's house. He felt a sense of unease wash over him as he continued to watch the object through his telescope. Suddenly, a beam of light shot down from the object, illuminating Jack's backyard. He watched in horror as a figure emerged from the light and began to approach him. The figure was humanoid in shape, but its skin was a sickly green color and its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. Jack was frozen with fear as the figure came closer and closer. Just when it seemed like the creature was about to grab him, Jack snapped out of his trance and ran inside his house, locking the door behind him. He quickly called the police and reported what he had seen. When the police arrived, they found no evidence of the creature or the UFO. Jack was left feeling shaken and traumatized by the experience, and he never used his telescope again. But every night, as he lay in bed, he could still feel the creature's eyes on him, watching and waiting for its next chance to strike. It was a dark and stormy night, and Jennifer was all alone in her big, creaking house. Her husband was away on a business trip, and her kids were staying over at their grandparents' house. Jennifer was feeling restless, so she decided to go down to the basement to sort through some old boxes and see if there was anything she wanted to donate to charity. As she made her way down the stairs, she felt a chill run down her spine. She brushed it off as just a draft and continued down to the basement. The musty smell of old cardboard hit her nose as she started to dig through the boxes. She found some old clothes and toys that her kids had outgrown, but nothing of real value. That's when she heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from behind one of the boxes. She froze, her heart racing. She tried to tell herself that it was just a mouse or a rat, but the sound was too loud and too deliberate to be an animal. She cautiously approached the box, and as she peeked behind it, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. They belonged to a figure crouched behind the boxes. Jennifer was frozen with fear as the figure started to crawl towards her. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was not human. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. The creature was inches away from her face when suddenly the lights turned on, and her husband walked into the basement. He had come home early from his business trip, and had decided to surprise her. Jennifer collapsed onto the floor, her heart pounding with relief. She couldn't believe how scared she had been over nothing. But as she looked back at the spot where the creature had been, she saw that there were scratch marks on the wall, and a faint smell of sulfur in the air. She couldn't explain it, but she knew that something had been down there with her, something that was not of this world. Carla had always been fascinated by the abandoned asylum on the edge of town. As a teenager, she and her friends would dare each other to sneak inside and explore the dark, decaying halls. Years later, Carla still couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum was calling out to her. One night, unable to resist the pull any longer, she snuck inside, hoping to find some long-forgotten relic or secret hiding place. As she made her way down a long, dimly lit hallway, she heard the sound of footsteps coming from behind her. Turning around, she saw a figure in the shadows, shrouded in darkness. Carla tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear as the figure stepped closer, revealing itself to be a ghostly apparition with glowing eyes and a twisted grin. The ghostly figure beckoned her forward, leading her deeper into the asylum, through dark and winding corridors. Carla was terrified, but she couldn't help feeling a strange sense of fascination and wonder as she followed the ghost deeper into the heart of the asylum. As they reached the end of the hallway, the ghostly figure stopped and turned to face her. It spoke, its voice a haunting whisper that sent chills down Carla's spine. "You have come too far," it said. "You cannot leave." Carla screamed, but the ghostly figure vanished into the shadows, leaving her alone in the asylum. She tried to run, but found herself trapped in a labyrinth of corridors and rooms. For days, Carla wandered the halls, lost and alone. She began to see strange things, shadows moving on the walls, ghostly whispers in her ear. She knew that she was losing her grip on reality, but she couldn't escape the asylum's grip. Years later, the police found Carla's body in the abandoned asylum, her eyes wide with terror and her face twisted into a permanent scream. The cause of death was never determined, but many locals believed that the ghostly figure had claimed another victim. Emily had always been afraid of the old abandoned mansion at the end of the street. The house was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of its former owner, a wealthy woman who had been brutally murdered by her own family. One night, Emily and her friends dared each other to sneak inside and explore the house. They laughed nervously as they tiptoed through the dark, cobweb-filled halls, telling each other ghost stories and jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. As they made their way up to the second floor, they heard a strange noise, a scratching sound, like something trying to claw its way through the walls. Emily's friends ran for the stairs, but Emily was frozen in place, too terrified to move. The scratching grew louder and more frenzied, until finally the wall gave way and a ghostly hand reached out and grabbed her by the throat. Emily tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips as the ghostly apparition dragged her deeper into the house, through twisting corridors and secret passages. Finally, they reached the master bedroom, where the ghostly figure released its grip on Emily's throat and disappeared into the shadows. Emily was alone in the room, surrounded by old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Suddenly, she heard a voice whisper in her ear, a voice that sounded like it was coming from beyond the grave. "Why have you come here?" the voice asked. Emily tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. She was trembling with fear as the ghostly figure materialized in front of her, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. "You should not have come here," the ghost said. "Now you will never leave." Emily screamed as the ghostly figure advanced on her, its hands reaching out to claim her soul. The mansion was never again visited by anyone, as the rumors of the curse. Mike had been working at the cemetery for years. He knew every inch of the place, from the oldest headstones to the newest graves. He had seen his fair share of spooky sights in the graveyard, but nothing had ever prepared him for what he encountered one night. It was a warm summer evening, and Mike was doing his usual rounds, checking on the graves and making sure everything was in order. As he made his way through the rows of headstones, he noticed something strange. One of the graves appeared to be glowing. At first, Mike thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he got closer, he realized that the glow was coming from the grave itself. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest, and peered down into the open grave. To his horror, he saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at him from the darkness. They were the eyes of a ghostly figure, who had risen from the grave and was now standing right in front of Mike. Mike tried to run, but the ghostly figure was too quick. It reached out and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him down into the open grave. Mike tumbled headfirst into the hole, landing hard on the dirt and bones that filled the bottom of the pit. He struggled to his feet, his heart racing, and tried to climb out of the grave. But the ghostly figure was too strong. It held him in place, its cold, clammy hands clutching at his throat. Mike gasped for air, his vision growing hazy, as the ghostly figure whispered in his ear. "You have disturbed my rest," it said. "Now you will suffer the consequences." Mike tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips as the ghostly figure dragged him down into the darkness of the grave. From that day on, the other cemetery workers avoided the grave where Mike had disappeared, too afraid to disturb a restless spirit that haunted the area. Captain John and his crew were sailing their freight ship across the Atlantic Ocean when the terrible storm hit. The winds howled and the waves crashed against the ship, threatening it to capsize it at any moment. As the night wore on, the storm grew worse. The crew huddled together, trying to keep warm and dry. They could barely see a few feet in front of them through the driving rain and the dense fog. Suddenly, something loomed out of the mist. It was another ship, but this one was unlike any ship the crew had ever seen. It was old and decrepit, with tattered sails and rusted chains. The ship seemed to be drifting aimlessly, but as it drew closer, the crew could see that there were figures on board. But these figures were not human, they were ghostly, transparent beings, floating through the air. The crew of the freight ship watched in horror as the ghostly ship sailed past them, disappearing back into the fog. But the encounter was not over. As the crew tried to make sense of what they had just seen, they heard strange noises coming from below deck. The sound of chains rattling, and whispers in a language they didn't recognize. One by one, the crew members started to disappear. They were dragged down into the depths of the ship by invisible hands, never to be seen again. Captain John was the only one left. He tried to steer the ship towards safety, but it was no use. The phantom ship had taken control, and it was heading straight for a rocky coastline. Just as the freight ship was about to crash into the rocks, the storm subsided. The fog lifted, and the ghostly ship disappeared into the night. Captain John was the only survivor, but he was never the same again. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the memory of the phantom vessel, and the ghostly figures that had claimed the lives of his crew. The moral of the story is that the sea can be a mysterious and dangerous place, and there are things out there that are beyond our understanding. It's important to respect the power of the ocean and to always be prepared for the unexpected. Samantha was thrilled when she received a beautiful antique doll as a gift from her grandmother. The doll had porcelain skin, curly blonde hair, and a lacy dress that Samantha couldn't take her eyes off of. She placed the doll on her bed and went to sleep. That night, Samantha woke up to find the doll sitting on her chest, staring at her with lifeless eyes. She screamed and pushed the doll away, but it just kept coming back. Every night, Samantha would wake up to find the doll sitting on her chest, sometimes with its hand around her neck. She tried to get rid of the doll, but it would always find its way back to her. One night, Samantha had enough. She grabbed the doll and threw it out the window. She watched as the doll fell to the ground, shattering into a million pieces. But the next morning, Samantha woke up to find the doll back in her room, good as new. She was terrified, but couldn't bring herself to get rid of it again. The doll seemed to take on a life of its own. It would move from room to room, and Samantha could hear its soft footsteps in the hallway at night. Sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of the doll out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find it was gone. One day, Samantha's grandmother came to visit. When she saw the doll, her face turned white as a sheet. "Where did you get this doll?" her grandmother asked. "It was a gift from you," Samantha replied. Her grandmother shook her head. "I never gave you that doll. That doll has been in our family for generations, and it's been known to be haunted." Samantha was terrified. She immediately got rid of the doll, and never saw it again. But even to this day, she can still feel its presence in her house. The moral of the story is that some objects can hold a dark energy, and it's important to be careful about what we bring into our homes. What may seem like a harmless antique could actually be something much more sinister. It was Halloween night, and a group of teenagers decided to explore the abandoned house at the end of the street. The house had been empty for years, and was said to be haunted. As they walked through the creaky old front door, the teens immediately felt a chill run down their spines. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the dusty floorboards. They made their way through the dimly lit rooms, peering into old cupboards and drawers. Suddenly, they heard a loud thumping sound coming from upstairs. They cautiously climbed the staircase, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they reached the top of the stairs, they saw a door at the end of the hallway slowly creaking open. They hesitated for a moment, then slowly made their way towards the open door. Inside, they saw a room covered in cobwebs, with an old chest sitting in the center. They cautiously approached the chest and opened it, revealing a small, old-fashioned music box. One of the teens wound up the music box, and a soft melody began to play. Suddenly, the room started to shake, and the teens felt as if they were being pulled in different directions. They tried to run, but their feet were glued to the ground. As the music box continued to play, they saw a figure materialize in front of them. It was the ghost of the former owner of the house, who had died years ago. The ghost warned them to leave the house immediately, or suffer the same fate as him. Terrified, the teens ran out of the house and never looked back. Years later, the abandoned house was demolished, and a new house was built in its place. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the haunting melody of the music box, and the ghostly voice of the former owner warning visitors to stay away. The moral of the story is that some places may be abandoned for a reason, and it's important to respect the history and potential dangers that may be associated with them. Once upon a time, there was a young couple who moved into a new house. They were thrilled to have found such a beautiful and spacious home, but they soon realized that something wasn't quite right. Every night, they heard strange noises coming from the attic. At first, they tried to ignore them, but they soon became too loud and too frequent to ignore. The couple tried to investigate the noises, but every time they climbed up to the attic, they found nothing out of the ordinary. One night, as they were lying in bed, the couple heard a sound of footsteps coming from the attic. They were too scared to investigate, so they decided to call the police. When the police arrived, they searched the attic but found nothing. Frustrated and frightened, the couple decided to sleep in the guest room that night. However, as they were lying in bed, they heard the same footsteps again, this time coming from the hallway outside their bedroom door. The couple panicked and tried to lock the door, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps grew louder and louder until they stopped right outside the door. Suddenly, the doorknob started to turn slowly. The couple screamed and shouted for help, but nobody could hear them. Eventually, the doorknob stopped turning, and the footsteps faded away. The couple never found out what happened that night, but they never slept in that house again. Legend has it that the house was haunted by the ghost of a previous owner who died in the attic. The ghost was angry and didn't want anyone else living in his house. As the sun began to set and the last bit of light disappeared from the sky, Sarah realized she was lost. She had been walking through the dense forest for hours, her feet aching and her stomach growling. Her phone was dead, and she had no map or compass to guide her way. The only thing she could do was keep moving forward. As she walked, the trees grew thicker and the sounds of the forest grew quieter. The only thing she could hear was the crunch of leaves beneath her feet and the rustling of the branches in the wind. The darkness was starting to set in, and Sarah realized she was completely alone in the woods. Suddenly, she heard a twig snap behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she picked up her pace, hoping to get out of the forest as quickly as possible. But then she heard it again, the sound of footsteps following her. She turned around again, but once more there was no one there. Her mind was playing tricks on her, she told herself. But the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. Panic set in as she started to run, the footsteps quickening behind her. She didn't know how long she ran for, but eventually, she tripped and fell to the ground. As she picked herself up, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. She could hear a low growling sound coming from whatever was staring at her. She tried to crawl away, but it was no use. The creature pounced on her, and Sarah knew she was done for. The next morning, the search party found Sarah's lifeless body lying in the forest. They searched for signs of what had killed her, but all they found were deep claw marks on her back. No one ever knew what attacked her that night, but the people of the town avoided that forest like the plague from then on. It was a beautiful summer day, and 4 friends had decided to go for a hike in the forest. They had been walking for a while when they noticed that the birds had stopped singing, and the forest had become eerily quiet. They shrugged it off and continued walking until they stumbled upon a clearing. In the middle of the clearing, they saw a strange creature. It was about the size of a large dog, but it had scales like a reptile and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to follow their every move. It moved with an unnatural grace, as if it was stalking its prey. The friends froze in fear as the creature began to approach them. It was fast and agile, and they knew they had no chance of outrunning it. They tried to back away slowly, but the creature kept advancing. Suddenly, one of the friends had an idea. He remembered reading somewhere that predators are often scared off by loud noises. He quickly took out his phone and played a loud rock song at full volume. To their surprise, the creature flinched and backed away. The friends took advantage of the creature's momentary hesitation and ran as fast as they could back to their car. As they drove away, They could see the creature in their rearview mirror, still watching them with its glowing eyes. To this day, the friends never spoke of their encounter with the mysterious predator in the forest. They knew that no one would believe them, and they didn't want to risk encountering it again. But every time they go hiking, they can't help but feel like they are being watched by the creature lurking in the shadows. The man who lived in the penthouse apartment of the high-rise complex was a mystery to many of the building's occupants. No one knew his name, and he was rarely seen out in public. The only indication that he even existed was the occasional glimpse of him in his apartment window, peering out into the night with a menacing glare. As the weeks went on, rumors began to circulate about the man's strange behavior. Some claimed to have seen him pacing back and forth in his apartment, muttering to himself in a language that no one could understand. Others swore that they had seen him performing strange rituals in his living room, surrounded by candles and other mysterious objects. Despite the rumors, no one could say for sure what the man was up to. But one thing was certain, his presence had a chilling effect on the other tenants of the building. Some began to avoid the elevators, opting instead to take the stairs, while others made a point of locking their doors at night and drawing their blinds. One night, however, a young woman who lived on the same floor as the man heard a strange noise coming from his apartment. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to be emanating from deep within the building's walls. The woman listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest, as the growling grew louder and more menacing. Suddenly, the noise stopped, and the woman was left standing there in the silence, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. She tried to convince herself that she had imagined the whole thing, that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but deep down she knew that something was very wrong. Over the next few weeks, the strange noises and unsettling behavior continued. More and more tenants reported seeing the man in his window at night, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Some even claimed to have seen him walking around the building in the dead of night, as if searching for something or someone. Finally, one evening, the police were called to the building, responding to a disturbance in the penthouse apartment. When they arrived, they found the man's apartment empty, save for a few scattered pieces of paper and strange symbols etched into the walls. The man was never seen again, and no one knew what had become of him. To this day, the tenants of the high-rise building still speak in hushed tones about the mysterious man who lived in the penthouse. Some believe that he was a sorcerer, dabbling in dark magic and calling forth demons from other realms. Others think that he was something even more sinister, a being from another dimension, who had somehow slipped into our world through a portal in his apartment. No one knows for sure what the man was up to, but one thing is certain, his presence has left a lasting mark on the building, and the people who lived there will never forget the terror that he brought with him. As a child, Sarah had always been afraid of the dark. Her parents had tried everything to get her to sleep through the night, from nightlights to soothing music, but nothing had worked. As she grew up, Sarah learned to cope with her fear by keeping herself busy during the day and avoiding being alone at night. One day, Sarah moved to a new city for work and found an apartment in an old building. It was perfect, cozy, affordable, and close to her workplace. But as soon as the sun set, she would feel uneasy. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind would make her heart race. It was like her childhood fear of the dark had come back to haunt her. One night, while she was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, Sarah heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder and more insistent, and Sarah realized with growing horror that someone or something was trying to get in. She tried to call the police, but her phone was dead. As she huddled under the covers, she could hear the tapping getting louder and louder until it turned into a violent banging. It felt like the entire building was shaking. And then, suddenly, the noise stopped. Sarah waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing else happened. She eventually managed to fall asleep, but the incident left her deeply unsettled. Over the next few nights, Sarah became increasingly paranoid. She would hear strange noises in the apartment, doors opening and closing on their own, and shadows moving in the corners of her vision. She felt like she was losing her mind. One night, Sarah finally worked up the courage to investigate the source of the strange occurrences. She went to the window where she had heard a tapping and saw a figure standing on the street below, staring up at her window. It was a man with a strange smile on his face, and Sarah knew instinctively that he was responsible for the terrifying experiences she had been having. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had disappeared. Sarah moved out of the apartment the next day, but she never forgot the feeling of being watched, in the sense that something deeply sinister had been lurking in the shadows of her own mind. There was a woman named Lisa who had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would sleep with a nightlight on and refused to go into dark places like basements or attics. As she grew older, her fear of the dark never went away. She would still sleep with a nightlight on and avoid going out at night whenever possible. One day, Lisa moved into a new apartment. It was a nice place, but there was one problem: the bedroom didn't have any windows. At first, she didn't think much of it, but as the days went by, she began to feel more and more uneasy. She started having nightmares about being trapped in a dark room with no way out. The nightmares became so intense that Lisa began to lose sleep. She would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close her eyes. She started to feel like something was watching her, even though she knew she was alone in the apartment. One night, Lisa heard a noise coming from the closet. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just her imagination, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. Finally, she got out of bed and walked over to the closet. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door, but when she did, she found nothing inside. Despite finding nothing in the closet, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She started to see strange shadows moving across the walls at night, and she heard strange whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. She started to wonder if she was losing her mind. One day, Lisa decided to try to face her fear of the dark head-on. She turned off all the lights in the apartment and sat in the darkness, trying to calm her nerves. As she sat there, she heard the sound of someone breathing. She turned on the lights, but there was no one there. From that day on, Lisa couldn't bear to be alone in the apartment. She moved out soon after, never knowing if the things she experienced were real or just a product of her imagination. Samantha had always been a bit of a perfectionist. She constantly obsessed over every detail of her appearance, spending hours in front of the mirror each day. But lately, she had noticed something strange. Every time she looked at a reflection, she felt like it was staring back at her with a sinister glint in its eye. At first, Samantha tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her imagination. But the feeling only grew stronger with each passing day. Soon, she found herself avoiding mirrors altogether, afraid of what she might see. One night, Samantha decided to confront her fears. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, forcing herself to meet her reflection's gaze. As she stared into the glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection was grinning at her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Samantha stumbled backwards, tripping over the bathmat and falling to the ground. As she lay there, she heard a voice whispering in her ear, "I am you, and you are me. We are one and the same." From that moment on, Samantha was never the same. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that her reflection was out to get her. She stopped leaving the house, afraid to face the world outside. And every time she looked in a mirror, she saw the same malevolent grin staring back at her. In the end, Samantha was found dead in her apartment, surrounded by shattered mirrors. The police ruled it a suicide, but some say that she was driven to madness by the sinister presence in her reflection, and that it was her own reflection that drove her to take her own life. There was once a woman named Lily who lived alone in a small apartment. She had always been a bit anxious, but lately, her anxiety had grown worse. She felt like she was constantly being watched, and every little noise made her jump. One day, Lily came home from work to find that her apartment had been broken into. Nothing was missing, but everything was out of place. Lily was terrified. She called the police, but they didn't find any evidence of a break-in. From that day on, Lily's anxiety became unbearable. She stopped leaving her apartment, stopped going to work, and stopped talking to her friends. She was convinced that someone was watching her, even when she was alone. One night, Lily was lying in bed, trying to calm herself down, when she heard a noise coming from the other room. She was frozen with fear, too scared to move. But the noise continued, getting louder and louder. Finally, Lily mustered up the courage to investigate. She crept out of bed and slowly made her way to the other room. When she turned on the light, she saw that her worst fears had come true. There was no one in the room but herself. The noise she had heard was only in her head. From that day on, Lily sought help for her anxiety. She learned that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we create in our own minds. John had always been a confident and charismatic man. He had a successful career and a loving family, but he had a dark secret that haunted him every day. Years ago, he had committed a murder, and he had managed to cover his tracks so well that no one ever suspected him. But the guilt ate away at him, and he knew that he could never truly escape the consequences of his actions. As time went on, John's mental health began to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid and anxious, always looking over his shoulder and jumping at every little sound. He couldn't sleep at night, haunted by nightmares of the person he had killed. He began to drink heavily, hoping to drown out the guilt and the fear. Despite his best efforts to keep up appearances, John's behavior began to attract attention. His colleagues at work started to notice that he seemed on edge all the time, and his family grew worried about his erratic behavior. But John refused to seek help, convinced that he could handle his problems on his own. One night, after a particularly heavy drinking session, John's mental state finally reached a breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore, couldn't live with the guilt and the fear and the shame. In a moment of desperation, he took his own life, leaving behind a devastated family and a legacy of secrets and lies. The police investigated John's death, but they never uncovered the truth about the murder he had committed. To the world, he was just another tragic suicide. But for those who knew him best, they knew that his death was the result of a lifetime of guilt and psychological torment. Once there was a man named David who always felt like he was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling of being observed by other people, but something much more eerie and unsettling. He would often catch glimpses of a shadowy figure out of the corner of his eye, but whenever he turned to face it, there was nothing there. At first, David tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the feeling persisted, and soon it began to consume his thoughts day and night. He became increasingly paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest sound. As time went on, David's mental state began to deteriorate. He started to see the shadowy figure more frequently, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer every time. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the figure was standing at the foot of his bed. David's friends and family grew concerned about his well-being and tried to persuade him to seek help. But David was convinced that nobody would understand what he was going through. He became increasingly isolated and started to lose touch with reality. One night, as David was walking home from work, he felt the presence of the shadowy figure behind him. He quickened his pace, but it seemed to be keeping up with him. He could feel its breath on the back of his neck, and he knew that he was running out of time. In a moment of desperation, David turned to face the figure. To his horror, he saw that it was not a shadowy apparition, but a manifestation of his own inner demons. He realized that the figure was a product of his own imagination, a manifestation of his deepest fears and insecurities. The realization was too much for David to bear. The psychological pressure had become too great, and he could no longer cope with the weight of his own mind. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony, and slipped into a catatonic state. David was taken to a mental institution, where he remained for the rest of his life. His family and friends could only look on helplessly as the man they once knew slowly faded away, consumed by the darkness that had haunted him for so many years. Once there was a man named Jack who always felt like his life was being dictated by unseen forces. He would try to make positive changes in his life, only to find himself in situations that seemed to be warning him against it. He would feel like he was being watched, as if something was trying to keep him in his current cycle of existence. Whenever Jack tried to break out of his routine, he would experience strange occurrences that seemed to be warning him of danger. For example, when he decided to quit his job and pursue a new career, he received a letter in the mail that warned him of the dangers of taking such a big risk. When he tried to move to a new city, he received a phone call from an unknown number that warned him of the dangers of leaving his comfort zone. No matter what Jack did, he always felt like he was being watched and controlled by some unseen force. His fear and paranoia grew with each passing day, and he started to believe that he was being targeted by some sort of supernatural entity. As Jack's paranoia reached its peak, he began to see visions of demons and other horrific creatures. They would taunt him, telling him that he was doomed to fail and that his efforts to break free were futile. Eventually, Jack's fear and paranoia became too much to bear, and he took his own life. As his body was discovered, a strange note was found nearby. It read, "I try to break free, but life was always watching me. It's too powerful to fight against, and I am finally giving up." No one knows for sure what happened to Jack, but some believe that he was indeed being controlled by unseen forces. His story serves as a warning to those who feel like they are stuck in their current situation and are looking to break free. Sometimes, it's best to accept the hand that life has dealt you, rather than try to fight against it. Mia had always been a vivid dreamer. She had grown used to the occasional nightmare, but lately they had become more frequent and more disturbing. Every night, she would be tormented by terrible visions of monsters, ghosts, and demons. They felt so real that she would often wake up sweating and trembling with fear. As the weeks went on, Mia's nightmares began to affect her waking life. She found it hard to concentrate at work, and she started to withdraw from her friends and family. She became obsessed with trying to figure out why she was having these dreams and what they meant. One night, Mia had a particularly vivid nightmare. In it, she was being chased by a faceless figure through a dark and twisted maze. She could hear its footsteps getting closer and closer, and she knew that if it caught her, she would never escape. When she woke up, she was gasping for air and covered in sweat. She tried to shake off the feeling of terror, but it lingered with her all day. That night, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She went to a sleep specialist and begged for something to help her sleep. The specialist prescribed Mia a powerful sedative, and she started taking it every night. At first, it seemed to work. She was able to sleep through the night without any nightmares. But then, something strange started to happen. Mia began to experience vivid hallucinations during the day. She would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision, and she would hear whispers and voices that no one else could hear. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality. One night, Mia had a particularly intense nightmare. In it, she was trapped in a dark room with no doors or windows. The walls were closing in on her, and she could feel the air getting thinner and thinner. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. When she woke up, she realized that she was actually trapped in a dark room. She had sleepwalked out of her bedroom and into the storage closet. She felt like she was losing her mind. Mia decided to stop taking the sedative, but it was too late. Her nightmares had already done their damage. She was never the same again. She would often have episodes of paranoia and hallucinations. She felt like she was being watched all the time, even when she was alone. In the end, her chronic nightmares had driven her to the brink of insanity. Once there was a man named Paul, who had lived through a tragedy that took the lives of everyone he loved. Paul was the sole survivor of a disaster that struck his town, and he was left with a profound sense of guilt and sadness. In the years that followed, Paul's mind began to play tricks on him, and he became convinced that the ghosts of his friends and family were haunting him. At first, Paul thought he was just imagining things. He would hear strange noises in his empty house, or catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye. But as time went on, the hauntings became more intense. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find his deceased wife sitting at the edge of his bed, or his deceased son standing in the corner of the room, staring at him with empty eyes. As the hauntings grew more frequent and intense, Paul's mental health began to decline rapidly. He became paranoid, convinced that the ghosts were angry with him for surviving the disaster while they all perished. He started seeing signs of their anger everywhere he went, on TV, in the news, in his dreams. Paul's obsession with the hauntings soon consumed his life. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped leaving his house altogether. His mind became a prison, and the ghosts of his loved ones were his only company. In the end, Paul could no longer bear the weight of his guilt and the haunting illusions in his mind. He believed that his loved ones were seeking revenge on him for surviving, and he could not handle the constant torment. So, he took his own life, hoping to escape the haunting and join his loved ones in the afterlife. The tragedy of Paul's story is a reminder of how easily the human mind can be broken by trauma and grief. The hauntings that he experienced were the manifestation of his own pain and guilt, and his inability to move on ultimately led to his own demise. Jenny had always been a bit of a loner. She was shy and kept to herself, preferring to spend her days lost in thought or buried in a book. Her parents tried to get her involved in extracurricular activities, but she always found an excuse to avoid them. One day, Jenny's parents decided to send her to a summer camp to help her make some friends and gain some independence. At first, Jenny was hesitant, but she eventually agreed to go. The first few days at camp were difficult for Jenny. She struggled to connect with the other campers and often found herself sitting alone during activities. But one day, she met a girl named Sarah who seemed to understand her. They bonded over their shared love of books and spent hours talking about their favorite stories. As the weeks went on, Jenny's relationship with Sarah grew stronger. They were inseparable and spent every moment together. But then, one day, Sarah disappeared. No one seemed to know what happened to her. The camp counselors searched everywhere, but there was no sign of her. Jenny was devastated. She spent the rest of the summer searching for Sarah, but to no avail. When Jenny returned home, she was a different person. She had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of her time alone in her room. Her parents tried to talk to her, but she refused to open up. It wasn't until several months later that Jenny's parents began to notice something strange. Jenny had started talking to herself, often carrying on long conversations with someone who wasn't there. She seemed to be living in a world of her own, detached from reality. Her parents took her to see a therapist, but nothing seemed to help. Jenny's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became paranoid, convinced that Sarah was still out there somewhere and that she was in danger. One day, Jenny disappeared. Her parents searched everywhere for her, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't until several weeks later that her body was found in the woods, just a few miles from her home. The autopsy revealed that she had died of exposure, but there was something else that caught the attention of the investigators. They found scratch marks on the inside of her wrists, as if she had been trying to escape from something. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Jenny. Some say she was haunted by the ghost of Sarah, while others believe she simply couldn't cope with the loss of her friend. But one thing is for certain, the mystery surrounding her death still haunts the town to this day. Once upon a time, there were 5 close friends named Alex, Bailey, Charlie, Dylan, and Ethan. They were known for their love of adventure, and they always sought out new, thrilling experiences. One day, they decided to explore an abandoned mansion located on the outskirts of town. It was rumored to be haunted, but they didn't believe in such things. They thought it would be exciting to see what was inside. When they arrived, they found the mansion was dark, decrepit, and overgrown with weeds. As they explored the rooms, they began to feel an eerie presence. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and shadows seemed to move on their own. They quickly realized they were not alone in the house. As they tried to leave, they found all the doors and windows were locked. The mansion had them trapped, and the malevolent force inside began to reveal itself. The friends started to see apparitions and hear haunting whispers, and they soon realized they were in grave danger. One by one, the malevolent force picked them off, tormenting them until they couldn't take it anymore. They were trapped and alone in the haunted mansion with no way to escape. As the night dragged on, they were consumed by the terror of the mansion and the realization that they might never make it out alive. Days later, the police found the abandoned mansion, but the friends were nowhere to be found. Their disappearance remains a mystery, but the rumors of the haunted mansion continue to persist, warning people not to venture inside, or they might suffer the same fate as Alex, Bailey, Charlie, Dylan, and Ethan. There was a small antique shop on the edge of town, and within it sat a peculiar object that no one could quite explain. It was a small wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns. The shopkeeper warned every customer who showed interest in it to stay away, as it was a cursed object with a history of bringing misfortune to its owners. But one day, a young couple ignored a warning and purchased the box. At first, nothing seemed to be amiss. The couple admired the intricate carvings and used the box to store trinkets and keepsakes. But soon, strange occurrences began to happen. Objects around the house would move on their own, strange noises could be heard in the middle of the night, and shadows would dart across the walls. The couple brushed it off as their imagination, but their friends began to notice a change in them. As time went on, tragedy struck. The couple's home was destroyed in a fire, and they barely escaped with their lives. They decided to move to a new town and start fresh, but the curse followed them. Everywhere they went, the box seemed to attract death and misfortune. Their loved ones started to die in bizarre accidents, and the couple themselves began to suffer from strange illnesses and nightmares. Desperate to break the curse, the couple returned to the antique shop and begged the shopkeeper to take the box back. But the shopkeeper simply shook his head and said it was too late. The curse had taken hold of the couple, and there was no escaping it. They left the shop defeated, knowing that the cursed box would continue to haunt them for the rest of their days. And so the box sat in the antique shop, waiting for its next victim to fall prey to its curse. For those who dared to possess it, the cursed box would bring only misfortune and death. Emma had always dreamed of living in a small, quaint town, so when she inherited a house from her late grandmother in the rural town of Ravenwood, she was thrilled to start her new life there. The town seemed perfect at first glance, with its picturesque streets and friendly neighbors, but as Emma settled in, she began to sense that something was off. She noticed strange symbols etched onto the walls of some buildings, and the townspeople seemed to be overly superstitious and wary of outsiders. Emma brushed it off as small-town quirks and tried to focus on her work as a writer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was lurking beneath the surface. As she dug deeper, Emma discovered that Ravenwood had a dark history. In the late 1800s, a group of townspeople had formed a cult that worshipped an ancient deity, and they had conducted unspeakable rituals in the woods surrounding the town. The cult had been disbanded and their leaders executed, but some believed that their dark influence still lingered. Emma found old journals and diaries in her grandmother's attic that revealed that her ancestor had been a member of the cult, and had even participated in some of the rituals. She also found a map that led to a hidden underground chamber beneath the town's church, where the cult had supposedly performed their most heinous acts. One night, Emma decided to investigate the chamber herself. As she descended the stairs, she could hear whispers and faint chanting coming from the darkness below. When she reached the bottom, she found herself face to face with a group of hooded figures, their faces obscured by masks. Before she could react, the figures grabbed her and began to chant in an ancient language. Emma tried to fight back, but her struggles were in vain. Suddenly, the ground beneath her opened up and she fell into a dark pit. When Emma woke up, she found herself in a cold, damp cell, with no idea how much time had passed. She could hear whispers and chanting coming from outside, and she knew that she was in grave danger. She realized too late that the sinister force lurking beneath the surface of Ravenwood was more powerful than she could have ever imagined, and she may not make it out alive. As Emma made her way through the tunnels, she began to feel a sense of hopelessness. The darkness was suffocating, and the walls felt like they were closing in on her. But she couldn't give up now. She had to find a way out. After what seemed like hours, Emma finally saw a faint light in the distance. Her heart filled with hope, and she quickened her pace. As she got closer, she realized that the light was coming from a small opening in the ceiling. She climbed up towards the light, and eventually emerged from the tunnel system into an abandoned warehouse. Emma stumbled out into the open air, gasping for breath. She had made it out alive. She called the police and told them everything she had seen. They didn't believe her at first, but when they investigated the tunnels themselves, they found evidence of the horrors she had described. Emma left the town shortly after, never wanting to return. She knew that whatever was down there in the tunnels was too dangerous to ignore, and she never wanted to be anywhere near it again. The Johnson family was excited to move into their new home, a large and spacious house that they could finally call their own. But as they began to unpack, they discovered something disturbing, a bloody handprint on the wall. They tried to ignore it, assuming it was just a remnant from the previous owners. But as time went on, strange things began to happen. Doors would creak open in the middle of the night. Footsteps could be heard in the hallways, and the family dog would bark and growl at empty corners of the room. The Johnsons tried to rationalize the occurrences, but they couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that hung in the air. One night, they found an old journal hidden away in a drawer. As they read through it, they realized that the previous owners had been brutally murdered in the home, and their killer was never caught. Suddenly, The strange occurrences made sense. They were being haunted by the spirits of the murdered family. But it wasn't just the ghostly presence that scared the Johnsons. They began to suspect that the killer may still be lurking around, stalking them in the shadows. One night, as they were settling in for bed, they heard a noise coming from downstairs. Mr. Johnson grabbed a baseball bat and headed to investigate, while Mrs. Johnson called the police. They searched the house, but found nothing. But the next morning, they found a chilling message written in blood on the living room wall: "I'm still here." The family was paralyzed with fear. They couldn't leave their home, and they couldn't stay. They were trapped in a nightmare, with no way out. And as they huddled together, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, they knew that the killer was still out there, watching and waiting. As soon as they had a chance, they escaped to the nearest hospital, where the family members were questioned by the police. The police were able to find evidence in the house that confirmed the killer was still inside. The killer was found hiding in a closet and was arrested without incident. The family was shaken up by the experience, but relieved that they were safe. The family later learned that the killer had been a disgruntled former employee of the previous occupants of the house. He had become obsessed with the family and had killed them in a fit of rage. The killer had been hiding in the house ever since, waiting for another family to move in. The family moved out of the house as soon as they could, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched. They were forever scarred by the experience and could never forget the horror they had encountered in that house. A group of strangers found themselves stranded on the deserted island after a freak storm sank their boat. They searched the island for any signs of life or civilization, but found nothing. As night approached, they gathered around a campfire, sharing their fears and anxieties about being stranded on the island. As they settled down to sleep, they heard strange noises coming from the surrounding jungle. They assumed it was just the sound of animals, but the noises continued, growing louder and more sinister. They soon realized that they were not alone on the island. The next morning, they found footprints in the sand that did not belong to any of them. The prints were large and had sharp claws, resembling those of a predator. They began to feel a sense of unease, and as the days passed, their fears intensified. One by one, the members of the group started to disappear. At first, they assumed that they were simply exploring the island or trying to find help, but as more and more people went missing, they knew that something was very wrong. They searched the island and found no trace of their missing companions, except for more footprints that were even bigger than before. One night, while they were huddled together for warmth, they saw two glowing eyes staring at them from the darkness. They realized that the creature that had been stalking them was not just an animal, but something much more sinister. They tried to defend themselves, but the creature was too powerful. One by one, they fell to the creature's claws, until only one was left. The survivor managed to build a raft and escape the island, but they were forever haunted by the memory of the creature that had killed their companions. They knew that they would never forget the terror they experienced on that deserted island, and they were certain that the creature was still out there, waiting for its next victim. Edward had always felt like an outsider, ever since he was a child. He was quiet and reserved, preferring to keep to himself rather than make friends. As he grew older, he found it increasingly difficult to connect with others, and as a result, he became more and more isolated. But it wasn't until he committed a terrible act in his late 20s that he truly began to retreat from the world. He was consumed with guilt and shame over what he had done, and he couldn't bear the thought of anyone finding out. He moved to a small cabin in the woods, far from civilization, and spent most of his days alone. He rarely ventured into town, and when he did, he kept to himself, avoiding eye contact and speaking as little as possible. Over time, the isolation began to take its toll. Edward became paranoid and delusional. convinced that everyone was judging him and whispering about him behind his back. He would spend hours pacing back and forth in his cabin, muttering to himself and imagining scenarios where he was publicly shamed and humiliated. As the years went by, his mental state deteriorated further. He became convinced that he was being watched, and that the people he had wronged were coming for him. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that he had heard footsteps outside his cabin. One day, he woke up to find that he could no longer distinguish reality from his own delusions. He had become completely consumed by his shame and guilt, and he could no longer live with himself. In a fit of despair, he took his own life. It wasn't until months later that a hunter stumbled upon Edward's cabin and found his remains. But by that point, it was clear that Edward had been gone for much longer than that. The cabin was overgrown with vines, and the only sounds were the creaking of the old wood and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Edward's tragic end was a stark reminder of the dangers of isolation and shame. It started with a fever, just a mild one, at first. But within hours, it had escalated into a full-blown illness. People were collapsing in the streets, writhing in pain as their bodies twisted and contorted in strange ways. As the days passed, the illness spread like wildfire. It didn't discriminate between young or old, rich or poor. Soon, the hospitals were overflowing with patients, and the doctors were powerless to stop it. But that was just the beginning. Within a week, those who had been infected began to change. Their skin turned a sickly shade of green, and their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. They grew claws and fangs, and their bodies twisted into grotesque, monstrous shapes. No one knew how to stop it. The military had been called in to quarantine the infected, but it was already too late. The monsters were multiplying faster than they could be contained, and soon they began to break free from their prisons. The world fell into chaos. The cities were overrun with the monsters, and those who survived were forced to flee to the countryside, hoping to find safety in isolation. But even there, they were not safe. The monsters prowled the forests and the fields, hunting for prey. And even those who managed to avoid their grasp were not immune to the sickness that had caused the outbreak in the first place. As the months passed, the survivors began to notice something strange. The monsters seemed to be growing weaker. They were slower, less aggressive. And eventually, they began to die off. But the damage had already been done. The world would never be the same. The survivors would carry the scars of the outbreak with them for the rest of their lives, haunted by the memories of the monsters that had once been their friends and loved ones. And no one would ever know the true cause of the illness that had brought about the end of the world. Dr. Emily Jones had always been fascinated by the paranormal. She had dedicated her entire life to studying and researching the unknown, often at the expense of her personal life. Her colleagues had always been wary of her experiments, but they never thought she would go so far as to conduct a dangerous experiment that would threaten the lives of everyone around her. It all started with a mysterious artifact that Dr. Jones had discovered on a recent expedition. It was said to contain an otherworldly energy that could unlock the secrets of the universe. Despite the warnings of her colleagues, Dr. Jones couldn't resist the temptation of unlocking its power. She spent months working on the artifact, performing countless tests and experiments. And then one day, something went terribly wrong. The artifact began to emit a bright light, and a supernatural force was unleashed, engulfing the entire laboratories in a blinding flash. When the light subsided, Dr. Jones found herself face to face with a creature unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a being made of pure energy, with tendrils of light extending in all directions. As she watched in horror, the creature began to lash out, destroying everything in its path. Dr. Jones knew that she had to stop the creature before it was too late. She tried everything she could think of to contain it, but nothing seemed to work. The creature was too powerful, and it continued to wreak havoc on the world around it. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Jones began to feel the weight of her actions. She knew that she had made a terrible mistake, and that her obsession with the unknown had caused irreparable damage. She became consumed by guilt and despair, and she knew that she would never be able to forgive herself for what she had done. In the end, it was too late. The creature had become too powerful, and it had consumed everything in its path. Dr. Jones was the only one left alive, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the creature would come for her. She closed her eyes and waited for the inevitable, knowing that her obsession had cost her everything. The man woke up in complete darkness, his head throbbing with pain. He tried to get up, but his limbs felt heavy, and his body was unresponsive. Panic began to set in as he realized he couldn't remember anything, not his name, not where he was, not even how he got there. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the darkness, a low growl that seemed to come from all around him. His heart pounded as he tried to make out his surroundings, but there was nothing to see, just an endless void of blackness. The growling grew louder, and he could hear something moving towards him. He tried to move, but his body refused to cooperate, leaving him trapped and vulnerable. Then, the creature revealed itself. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, a monstrous being with razor-sharp teeth and glowing eyes. It circled around him, its growling growing louder and more menacing by the second. The man knew he had to escape, but he didn't even know where to run. He closed his eyes and focused, trying to remember anything about himself, his life, or how he ended up in this terrifying place. Slowly, bits and pieces of memory started to come back to him, but they were fuzzy and incomplete. He remembered the name, Jack, but he didn't know if it was his own or someone else's. He remembered a woman's face, but he couldn't place her name or her relationship to him. It was as if his memories had been shattered and scattered, leaving him with only fragments to piece together. But even with these vague memories, Jack knew one thing for sure: he had to get away from the creature that was stalking him. He pushed himself up, his limbs still heavy and uncooperative, and began to stumble forward, hoping to find some kind of escape. As he stumbled through the darkness, he heard the creatures growling behind him, getting closer and closer. His heart raced as he realized he was running out of time, but then something strange happened. The darkness began to lift, and he saw a faint light in the distance. With renewed hope, Jack pushed himself forward, his body finally responding to his commands. As he got closer to the light, he could see that it was coming from a door that led to another room. He burst through the door, hoping to find safety on the other side, but he was greeted by a sight that chilled him to the bone. The room was filled with mirrors, each one reflecting back his terrified expression. And standing behind him, in the mirror directly behind him, was the creature, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Jack realized too late that he had been running in circles, trapped in a nightmare from which he could not escape. Ron had always been a heavy sleeper, but when he woke up that morning, he knew something was wrong. He tried to stretch and yawn, but his limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. He opened his eyes, and to his horror, he saw that his entire room was covered in a thick layer of slime. Panicking, Ron tried to sit up, but he realized that he was tied to his bed. That's when he noticed that the world around him was eerily silent. No sound came from outside the room. He looked towards the window, only to see that the glass was shattered, and the curtains were torn apart. The room was so cold that Ron could see his breath fogging up in the air. As he struggled to free himself from the bindings, Ron heard a noise outside the door. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. He could hear something dragging its feet across the floor, coming closer and closer. Finally, the door creaked open, and Ron saw what was waiting for him on the other side. His family had turned into grotesque monsters with sharp teeth and claws, and they were all staring at him hungrily. Ron tried to scream, but his voice was caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, and he didn't understand how it could happen. Ron was alone, trapped in his own house, with his family turned into monsters and hunting him down. The only thing he could do was fight for his life and try to find a way out before it was too late. In the small town of Cedarville, there was an old hotel that had been standing for over a century. It was once a popular spot for travelers passing through, but as the years went on, it fell into disrepair and became abandoned. Many locals believed that the hotel was cursed and haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. One night, a group of friends decided to explore the old hotel for thrills. They sneaked into the building through a broken window and made their way up to the second floor. As they were walking down the hallway, they began to feel a chill in the air, and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. It was as if someone was watching them. Suddenly, they heard a sound of footsteps coming towards them. They turned around, but no one was there. Then, they heard a faint whisper in their ear. It sounded like a woman's voice, but they couldn't make out what she was saying. The friends started to feel uneasy, and they decided to leave the hotel. But as they turned around, they saw a figure in the distance. It was a woman in a white dress, standing at the end of the hallway. She appeared to be floating in midair, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The friends were frozen in fear, unable to move as the woman started to glide towards them. As she got closer, they realized that she was not alone. Dozens of other ghostly figures appeared around her, all staring at the friends with an unquenchable hunger in their eyes. The friends tried to run, but they couldn't escape. The ghosts surrounded them, pulling them closer and closer towards the woman in the white dress. As they were enveloped in the ghostly embrace, they felt their very souls being drained away, until they were nothing but empty shells. The next morning, the police were called to the hotel by a concerned neighbor who had heard screams in the night. When they arrived, they found the bodies of the friends, all drained of their life force, their faces twisted in terror. From that day on, no one dared to enter the haunted hotel again. It remained abandoned, a testament to the horrors that lay within its walls. In the small town of Midwood, there was an old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. Rumors had always circulated about the dark and twisted experiments that took place there, but nobody had been inside for years. One day, a group of teenagers decided to sneak into the asylum for some thrills. As they explored the decrepit halls, they noticed strange symbols etched into the walls and floors. Suddenly, they heard a low growling noise coming from down the hallway. One by one, the teenagers started disappearing, until only one was left. She frantically searched for her friends, but all she found were bloody handprints and scratch marks. As she tried to escape, she realized that the doors were all locked, trapping her inside with the unknown terror. Suddenly, she heard a voice whispering her name. She turned around to see a ghostly figure with glowing eyes staring back at her. Frozen with fear, she watched as the figure slowly approached, reaching out with a hand covered in blood. The girl screamed and ran as fast as she could, trying to find an exit. But no matter where she turned, she found herself back in the same hallway. Eventually, she collapsed to the ground, exhausted and terrified. As she lay there, she heard the ghostly figure whisper in her ear, "You'll never leave this place." Once a year, a group of childhood friends made a tradition of going camping in the dense woods outside of their hometown. They looked forward to the escape from their daily lives, the crisp air, and the opportunity to reconnect with one another. This year, however, something was different. As they set up camp in a clearing, they noticed an eerie stillness in the air, and the woods seemed to be devoid of any animal sounds. None of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories of their lives since they had last seen each other. But as the night grew darker, the unsettling feeling in the air intensified. They heard strange rustling noises in the bushes, and the fire seemed to flicker and dim inexplicably. Suddenly, one of the friends, Alex, let out a scream. They turned to see him being dragged into the darkness by an unseen force. They rushed to his aid, but he was gone without a trace. Panic set in among the remaining friends, and they quickly gathered their things and made a run for it. But as they stumbled through the woods, they realized that they were being pursued by something inhuman, something that seemed to be toying with them. One by one, the friends were taken, dragged into the darkness by an unseen force. Their screams echoed through the woods, but no one was there to help them. In the end, only one of them survived, barely escaping with their life. Years later, the survivors still cannot forget the terrifying ordeal in the woods. They still hear the whispers of the darkness and the rustling of the leaves, and they know that something evil is still out there, waiting for its next victim. Carla and Jake had just moved into their dream house. It was a beautiful old Victorian-style home with plenty of charm and character. The house had been on the market for a while, but the couple couldn't believe their luck when they were able to buy it for a steal. However, they soon discovered the reason why the house was so cheap. From the moment they moved in, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close by themselves, objects would move on their own, and they would hear strange noises in the middle of the night. At first, they brushed it off as just their imaginations, but the occurrences became more frequent and more frightening. One night, Carla woke up to find a woman standing at the foot of their bed. She was dressed in a flowing white dress and had long, black hair. The woman didn't say anything, but her eyes were filled with anger and malice. Carla screamed and woke Jake up, but when he turned on the light, the woman was gone. The couple began to do some research on the history of the house and discovered that it had once been owned by a woman named Elizabeth. She had lived there in the early 1900s and had been brutally murdered by her husband. Her ghost was said to haunt the house, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to disturb her peace. As the days went on, the couple became more and more frightened. They tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They even tried to sell the house, but no one was interested in buying it. One night, as they were sleeping, they heard a loud crash coming from the living room. When they went to investigate, they found that a portrait of Elizabeth had fallen off the wall and shattered into a million pieces. Suddenly, they heard a loud, menacing laugh coming from the darkness. Carla and Jake knew that they had to do something to put Elizabeth's spirit to rest. They contacted a local paranormal investigator, who told them that they needed to perform a ritual to cleanse the house of the evil presence. They followed the instructions and lit candles, burned sage, and recited incantations. When they finished, they felt a sense of relief wash over them. The house was quiet, and they knew that Elizabeth's spirit had finally been put to rest. They decided to stay in the house and make it their home, but they never forgot the terror they had experienced. They knew that they would always be haunted by the memory of Elizabeth's vengeful spirit. It seemed like a fun idea at first. 6 strangers had signed up to participate in an escape room game that promised to be challenging, but not dangerous. The game was set up in an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of town. It was a perfect location for a spooky game, with creaky floorboards and dimly lit rooms. As they entered the game, the strangers split up to search for clues. The first room was fairly easy to solve, But as they moved on to the second room, things started to get strange. The door slammed shut behind them, and they realized they were locked in. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. The game was supposed to last an hour, but they had no idea how to escape. As they frantically searched for a way out, they started to notice that the clues were not just puzzles, but also warnings. One clue read, "There were a room with no exit," but they had already entered a room that seemed to have no way out. Another clue read, "Time is running out," and they noticed that the clock on the wall was ticking down faster than it should be. As the group moved from room to room, they began to realize that the game was not just a game. The clues seemed to be leading them down a dark and dangerous path, and they started to hear strange noises coming from the walls. In the final room, they found a message scrawled on the wall in blood, "You have been chosen." Suddenly, the lights went out, and they were plunged into complete darkness. That's when they heard it, a low growling sound that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It grew louder and more ferocious, and they realized that something was in the room with them. As their eyes adjusted to the darkness, they saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at them from the shadows. They tried to run, but the door was locked tight. They were trapped with the thing in the darkness. The next morning, the game operators found the escape room with no sign of the 6 participants. The police searched the building, but found no trace of them. It was as if they had disappeared without a trace. The escape room game was shut down, but rumors persisted that something malevolent still lurked in the old building. Those who entered never returned, and it was said that the spirit of the game's creator was still seeking new players to join his twisted game. Detective Mark had seen his fair share of strange cases, but the string of unexplained disappearances in the small town of Millfield had him baffled. Over the past few months, several people had gone on missing without a trace, and despite his best efforts, he had no leads. The townspeople seemed on edge, and Mark sensed that there was more to this case than meets the eye. He decided to dig deeper and began his investigation by visiting the homes of the missing persons. As he questioned family members and friends, he noticed a common thread: they all seemed to be hiding something. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that there was a dark secret that the town was trying to keep hidden. One night, while patrolling the deserted streets, Mark heard a strange noise coming from the old abandoned mill at the edge of town. Curiosity getting the best of him, he decided to investigate. As he approached the mill, he noticed a faint light coming from inside. Drawing his gun, he entered the building and found himself in a large room filled with dozens of people, all of whom had gone on missing in the past few months. At the center of the room was a group of townspeople, dressed in black robes and performing a sinister ritual. Mark realized with horror that they were sacrificing the missing persons to some sort of dark entity. He tried to intervene, but the townspeople overpowered him, revealing that they were all part of a secret cult that had been controlling the town for generations. They had sacrificed countless innocent lives to appease the dark entity, ensuring the town's prosperity and success. Mark was their latest sacrifice, and he knew that he wouldn't make it out alive. As they prepared to perform the ritual, he silently cursed the town and its people, knowing that their dark secret would forever haunt him. The next day, the town was eerily quiet, and there was no sign of Detective Mark. The case of the missing persons was closed, and the town continued to thrive, its prosperity forever tied to the blood sacrifice of innocent lives. Alice had always loved antiques, so when she stumbled upon a small antique store while exploring the city, she couldn't resist going inside. The shop was dimly lit, with an eclectic mix of items displayed on shelves and tables. As she wandered through the aisles, she came across an ornate antique mirror that caught her eye. The mirror had an intricate gold frame with a faded, smoky glass surface that seemed to hold a mystical quality. The shopkeeper noticed Alice admiring the mirror and approached her. "That's a very special mirror, miss," he said. "It has a long and mysterious history, and many people believe it to be cursed." Alice was intrigued. She had never heard of a cursed mirror before. "What kind of history?" she asked. "It's said to have belonged to a powerful witch who used it to cast spells and curses on her enemies," the shopkeeper explained. "She was eventually caught and burned at the stake, but the mirror survived. Legend has it that whoever possesses the mirror will experience strange and terrifying occurrences." Alice was skeptical but fascinated by the mirror's story. She decided to buy it and take it home with her. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as the days passed, Alice began to notice strange things happening around her. The room where she hung the mirror always seemed colder than the rest of the house, even on warm days. And sometimes, when she looked into the mirror, she could swear she saw a figure standing behind her, even though no one was there when she turned around. One night, Alice woke up to a loud crash. She ran to the living room and found the mirror had fallen off the wall and shattered on the floor. But when she looked at the broken pieces, she realized something even more disturbing. The reflection in the mirror was not her own, it was the face of the witch from the mirror's legend. Alice knew then that the mirror was truly cursed, and that she had to get rid of it before it was too late. She gathered the broken pieces and took them back to the antique shop, where the shopkeeper accepted them without a word. But even after the mirror was gone, Alice could still feel its presence in her house. She never felt truly safe in that room again, always wondering if the mirror's curse still lingered. And sometimes, late at night, she could swear she heard the cackling laughter of the witch echo in through the empty room. Detective Jameson had seen his fair share of gruesome crime scenes during his career, but nothing could have prepared him for the case that landed on his desk one day. A young woman had been found murdered in her home, her body mutilated in a way that suggested the killer had been playing a sick game with her. As Jameson began his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this case than just a random act of violence. The evidence pointed towards a ritualistic killing, but he had no idea what kind of cult or group would be behind something so gruesome. As the days passed, Jameson became more and more obsessed with the case. He worked around the clock, following every lead and interviewing anyone who might have information. But every time he thought he was getting close to a breakthrough, something would happen to set him back. One night, while he was working late in his office, Jameson heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find a woman standing there, her face obscured by a hood. "Detective Jameson," she said in a low, gravelly voice. "You're getting too close to the truth. You need to back off before it's too late." Before Jameson could respond, the woman disappeared into the darkness. He was left standing there, heart pounding, wondering who or what he was up against. The next day, Jameson received a package in the mail. Inside was a severed finger, the skin stripped off and the bone carved with strange symbols. A note was attached, warning Jameson to stop his investigation. But Jameson wasn't the kind of detective who gave up easily. He continued to dig deeper, determined to solve the case no matter what. As he got closer to the truth, the threats became more frequent and more violent. Jameson began to fear for his own safety, but he refused to give up. Finally, after months of investigation, he uncovered a dark cult that was responsible for the murder and other atrocities. With the help of his fellow detectives, Jameson was able to bring the cult to justice. But the experience had left him shaken, and he knew that he would never be able to forget the horrors he had uncovered. Once a kind and gentle person, Sarah's life took a dark turn after being bitten by a strange spider. At first, The bite seemed innocuous, but soon she began to feel strange. Her personality shifted, becoming darker and more aggressive. Her friends and family noticed the change, and they grew increasingly concerned. She became short-tempered and easily agitated, snapping at those around her and even engaging in physical altercations. But the scariest part was the look in her eyes. They had changed, becoming colder and more distant, like there was something malevolent lurking behind them. As the days went on, her behavior grew even more erratic. She began to have vivid nightmares and even hallucinations. She saw visions of spiders crawling all over her body, and heard strange whispers in her ear that she couldn't understand. Despite her protests, her family finally convinced her to seek medical attention. After undergoing several tests, doctors found that her blood contained a toxic substance that they couldn't identify. They speculated that it could be related to the spider bite, but they couldn't be sure. Sarah's condition continued to worsen. She began to experience physical changes as well, developing unusual bumps and growths on her skin. Her hair fell out in clumps, and her eyes became bloodshot and sunken. Her family was afraid of her, and they began to avoid her as much as possible. One night, while alone in her room, Sarah experienced a seizure. Her body convulsed violently, and she screamed in agony. Her family rushed in, but there was nothing they could do. Sarah died that night, her body twisted and distorted, a shell of the person she used to be. The cause of her death was never fully understood, but rumors spread about the spider bite and the mysterious poison that had taken over her body. Some say that she was possessed by an evil spirit, while others believe that the spider itself was cursed. But one thing was certain: Sarah's story served as a warning to others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the unknown and the consequences of delving too deep into mysteries beyond our understanding. Once upon a time, a young couple named Emily and Jake bought their first home together. The house was beautiful and seemed perfect for them, but they soon discovered that it was not the peaceful haven they had hoped for. As they settled in, strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own. Footsteps could be heard coming from empty rooms, and objects would move by themselves. At first, they dismissed it as their imagination, but as the occurrences grew more frequent and intense, they couldn't deny that something was wrong. One night, Emily woke up to find a figure standing at the end of their bed. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long dark hair and a face twisted in anger. Emily screamed, waking Jake, but when they turned on the lights, the woman was gone. The couple soon learned that the woman was the former owner of the house, who had died years before. Her spirit was angry and vengeful, and she wanted them out of her home. The hauntings grew worse, with objects flying across the room, eerie whispers in the night, and even physical attacks on the couple. They tried to leave, but found themselves unable to escape the house's grip. One night, the couple decided to investigate the basement, which they had previously avoided. They found a hidden room, filled with old items belonging to the previous owner, including a diary detailing her pain and suffering while living in the house. The spirit appeared, angry and enraged, and began to attack them. Emily and Jake were able to escape the house, but they knew that the spirit of the former owner would continue to haunt and terrorize anyone who dared to enter the home. They left, vowing to never return, and to warn others about the haunted house. Years later, the house still stands, abandoned and derelict. But people say that on quiet nights, you can hear the sound of a woman weeping, and the creaking of old floorboards as the vengeful spirit of the former owner continues to haunt the home.